Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Moore. I'm the Town Administrator for the Town of Stratham. Welcome back to our afternoon kind of workshop. Really appreciate you coming. We are here to focus on an introduction to the open space plan concept. And I'm joined by Town Planner Mark Connors, as well as the owner of the firm, which is Resilience Planning and Design, Stephen Whitman, who performs a lot of these open space type plans and studies in his work. We have a kind of a limited invitation workshop today for members of the Select Board, Planning Board, Conservation Commission, Trail Management Advisory Committee, Heritage Commission, and Park Association. We identified those stakeholders internally as those folks who would be interested in following and getting into depth on an open space plan for Stratham. The plan and the need for the plan is articulated in our master plan, and we're at the stage where we're trying to build the knowledge and gain the perspective of a broader group of people in Stratham to inform what our open space plan process and product are going to look like. So the goal for today is extraordinarily modest in that regard. We haven't defined a scope of work for an RFP. We haven't selected a firm to work with. We haven't chosen a schedule. We are at the stage of trying to inform ourselves about options so that we can choose a scope, choose a process that will be the result in the best product that is most tailored to Stratham's needs, and we're hoping you'll help us with that. We have invited those groups here today, but we realize not everyone can make this event. So Mark has taken the initiative to do a survey to get at some basic questions that we hope we'll be able to go through today. And I think, how many, Mark, responses so far?
About half a dozen.
So of all those invitees that I mentioned up front, in addition to you attending today, there's another half dozen open-ended response surveys that have been filled out. Additionally, as you can tell, we're having this recorded so that we can use this as a resource for others who might want to learn about what is the context for an open space plan, what does it do, and how can it be helpful. So I'm going to turn this over to Mark to do some initial contextual setup for Stratham. And then we're going to ask Steve Whitman, who's here because he's done this work in a lot of communities in New Hampshire and beyond. He's learned what's worked and what's not worked, and we're hoping to learn from him and really just get some examples of how these can be useful in guiding our planning and our work here in town. So, thank you very much for taking aside the time. And Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. I'm the town planner, and I'm relatively new with the town, so Allison is here. We have a few members from the Conservation Commission and Seth, our rec director. So if I mess anything up, please don't hesitate to jump in. Talk a little bit about some of the town's investments in open space planning. This effort we planned for in our capital improvement plan. We have about $45,000 set aside just for this plan. And we update that annually, so we have to calibrate that a little bit. Next year, we certainly can. Between 2009 and 2019, the town has set aside funding for land conservation for about ranging from $15,000 to $35,000. We stopped doing that in 2019. However, beginning in 2017, we've set aside funding for heritage preservation in the amount of $50,000 over the years. The town really been, I think, the biggest kind of benchmark for Stratham was 2002. That's when the town meeting was $5 million bond to support land conservation in Stratham. We may have some modest funding commitments in our CIP that go specifically for bicycle and pedestrian improvements. This plan comes out of the 2019 master plan, some of those recommendations. And this is extremely consolidated. I just put some of the big things that came out of the 2019 master plan. I didn't have the space to put everything, but what was recommended in the master plan was to expand our trail network and to do a trail master plan. We're hoping we can incorporate some of that in open space plan. Another recommendation was to do a master plan for the Stratham Park specifically, and we really laid the groundwork for that with our TMAC committee, which has put together a great kind of opening plan for the park. Another big recommendation is to better inventory and publicize open space land, recreation facilities in Stratham, and where public access is allowed, where it isn't allowed, it varies across Stratham. To better promote our guidelines and priorities for acquiring open space, when the Conservation Commission has an opportunity to acquire land, how are we kind of rating properties based on our scorecard? Another recommendation was to do management plans for individual open space properties, continue to acquire open space easements when we can, preserve historic structures to the best of our ability. This is something we've certainly made progress on. Part of that is the Route 33 heritage zoning that passed this year. Pretty much it for some of the big recommendations of the 2019 master plan. Stratham's kind of an interesting town in that the Industrial Revolution bypassed the town. In the Revolutionary War period, we were a pretty important town, and we actually lost population. We had a low point of about 500 in 1920, and it wasn't until 1950 that the town really started to grow. Particularly in the 80s was our kind of big growth period. That's when the town doubled in population. I just threw some photos of these are kind of these are 80s era houses, and you see these kind of all over Stratham. This is an estimate. It's approximately where we are in terms of land that we've set aside for preservation. About 1,700 acres is under conservation or agricultural easements. About 115 acres is owned by New Hampshire Fish and Game. And the town owns almost 500 acres. That equates to approximately 24% of the town land area that's set aside as protected open space. In terms of agricultural land, obviously Stratham, its roots are really in agriculture. We currently have approximately 2,000 acres of agricultural land, although that's high because that's just based on the full acreage for a parcel. If there's some agricultural use happening, so half of it's just forest land. We're capturing that as ag land. It's probably a little bit high, although 1,100 acres of those are protected. Back in 1953, the town had about 3,500 acres of agricultural land. So obviously, we've lost some of that, but the town has done a reasonably good job of protecting agricultural land. Those losses are a lot more in other communities in Hampshire. And this map shows some of that conserved land. I would caution the orange parcels are they're common land for cluster subdivisions. Some of those are protected, but I would say most of them aren't. So technically, the HOA could come back to the town. And we've had a couple where they've done like solar installations, or hypothetically, they could develop parts of that land. If it wasn't developed to its maximum capacity. So just some other things we look at, the map on the left, that's habitat rankings for land in Stratham. The green is the highest ranked habitat. brown is kind of supporting landscapes. The yellow is kind of that mid-range. The map on the right that shows forest land and surface water. We don't really think of ourselves as a coastal community, although we do capture the southern end of Great Bay. And obviously, the Swampscott is a tidal river. So this is a map showing some of the projected impact from sea level rise associated with climate change. And it's most pronounced at along College Ave, along the area where the favorite thing, the farm. Stewart Park. So that's pretty much it for my talk. I'll hand it over to Steve.
I completely forgot what I was going to talk about, so I'm just thinking about Stratham. So my name is Steve Whitman. Mark asked me to put together just a short kind of overview presentation, so I'm not going to talk a long time. But what I'm going to try to do is just talk about some of the things that communities are thinking about when they're doing open space plans. And then I'm hoping that we can just have some discussion. So feel free to stop me if you have a clarifying question, or we'll have plenty of time to just have some discussion and we can provide additional examples of things. And some of that could also be follow-up, through Mark for this meeting. But our firm has done a series of different, you can leave this time. We've done a series of different open space related efforts. The most common ones for New Hampshire are through the master plan. So often in the master plan, like what you just went through here, there's some element of analysis that happens to know how you're doing, what future opportunities exist, what threats to open space protection may exist. But in New Hampshire, it doesn't typically end up being kind of a full-blown open space plan. Some other states provide funding. Massachusetts, a lot of communities have open space plans, and they have a pretty linear process that's followed for open space plans. And then there are regional efforts. So a lot of the open space planning we've been part of has actually been through organizations like CELT or Five Rivers Conservation, bigger groups, watershed scale groups, or regional conservation groups who are looking at land use patterns, open space protection possibilities, and stating what they think the priorities are. So kind of beyond municipal scale. It would just be helpful to maybe go quickly, just first name and who you think you're representing today, just to get a sense. I know I get a little sense as some people came in. And then we'll just touch on some of those elements of open space planning, a couple of examples just to kind of tease out what the possibilities are and go from there. Does that make sense? So I think it was Tom.
Yeah, I'm with Tom House, Chairman of the Planning Board.
Kate Durgancy, I'm on the Trail Management Advisory Committee and the Recreation Commission.
Seth Hickey, Parks and Recreation Director, and staff liaison to the TMAC group.
Kyle Saltonstall, Conservation Commission.
Bob Keatings, Conservation Commission.
Brad Jones, Conservation Commission.
The Mitchell Heritage Commission, and I'm curious if there are any people here who are on the ad hoc conservation bond committee that we had for a number of years. No?
Was that in 2002?
Yeah.
Okay.
Apparently not.
Okay. Dan Crow, Stratham Hill Park Association.
David Moore, Town Administrator.
Allison Knapp, Vice Chair of the Select Board and Conservation Commission.
Mark Connors, the town planner.
All right, do you want to just go to the next slide? I'll just go through this quick. So I'm here, happy to help out two colleagues as you just kind of talk about this, because not enough New Hampshire communities, I think, are taking the step that you potentially will take to do your own space plan and think about how you can approach strategic conservation. So the work that I do, I don't want it to be confused as I'm out there doing this by myself. I have 3 other people that I work with through the firm. So we have GIS skills in-house, we have graphic design, we have natural resource science backgrounds as well, and then I also bring an education piece to it from my education background. But we work in New Hampshire, in other New England states, and I'll show a couple of examples. We've been working a lot in Pennsylvania because they have a really robust conservation landscape program that's actually serving their towns as well. Go to the next Okay, so one of the things we often do when we're talking about open space with the community at the master plan scale or in a more dedicated planning process that you might go through is to start to frame what are these open spaces. And so this concept of green infrastructure we use a lot around water resource protection, water quality, but green infrastructure or living infrastructure is a lot of what we all enjoy about our open spaces. So whether it's the forest lands and farmlands in Stratham today, the surface waters that may be within protected lands, that's part of the infrastructure that is providing you with clean air, clean water, that's giving you a quality of life here in town that probably attracted many of the residents. It's something that is at risk over time as we build our roads and driveways in homes and commercial operations and kind of fragment it. And so the maps were helpful, the ones that you showed, Mark, because they show over time in every community, there's some fragmentation, right, of these natural resource networks. But if we recognize what you've already protected, what's of value to you, like what your priorities are as a community, and what could still be protected, we can also start to quantify what benefits are you getting. And what opportunity do you miss if you don't protect that land? What do you have to start to commit to as far as cleaning stormwater, cooling buildings, some of these things. So a lot of times we won't use that term, green infrastructure, knowing you are coming from a lot of different municipal boards and committees. I figured it's probably a term that you've heard before. But we can frame that, we can frame it as living infrastructure, which is another way to think about it. Our yards, our forests, our parklands, which also provide a place for trails and community and things like that. Go to the next slide. And one of the reasons I mentioned that is because this concept of ecosystem services, which is probably not of a lot of interest to the average person, well, we can talk about what are the benefits of open space in Stratham and start to talk about many of the services provided, recreation, aesthetics, stewardship, habitat, biodiversity, photosynthesis, soil, food. You start to tell a story that's specific to here. Your open space network is going to have some similarities with other towns in Hampshire, but there are also going to be some distinct differences. I think the coastal resilience piece that you pointed out, even if it's just one area of the community, it's an important one. And it's going to be of concern to those property owners. So I think in a lot of cases, whether it's at the master plan level or an open space plan, the question is, why should we do this? Like, why should we do the plan? Why should we bond for protecting land? It's a finite resource. And if we can start to talk about the true value that you're getting out of these properties and when they're interconnected, how much better they work for wildlife and for people, you can start to come up with a strategy that works for your community. All right, enough lecturing. So the basic components that we see it, we can do this in different combinations and you can create subtasks, but there's an inventory component where you, using GIS and looking at the master plan and other documentation, you understand what do you have today. And Mark already started kind of painting a picture of like what exists today, what's left, what's been already kind of preserved in perpetuity. So we do a full inventory typically, and then with feedback that you're starting to formulate, we start to analyze what's important. You have more farmland than a lot of other communities in New Hampshire. So agricultural land, the ability to grow food and have some food security in the state, maybe that's a priority. Maybe it's just the open space and vistas that people like to see it as they come and go from home to work. But that kind of analysis can be both scientific analysis, we can use GIS, we can look at the interplay between resources, and it can also be much more anecdotal. You know, what kind of stories can you get the public to tell you about what they value? In different parts of the community, how they may view them differently. So the analysis is often really tied to this outreach and engagement piece, which is we can show maps, we can show data, we can show different strategies forward, but talking to people about what do they want to see and what would they support. You know, so if you're at 24% protected open space and everyone were to come out and say we want to be at 50%, well, what's the price tag for that? Does everybody still want that? Or do you have some interim steps that people would be more supportive of? So inventory analysis, outreach and engagement, all ultimately coming down to what do we want to do? What's our goal? what kinds of properties, what kinds of infrastructure in some cases, parking, signage, trails, some of the things it sounds like your group's already working on, what kind of investments there are important to your open space network, what kind of education or engagement of the public ongoing is important, and how does all that translate into actions, and who's responsible, and what's a reasonable timeline. And so in the action part of this, we typically look at a lot of non-regulatory actions. How do you think through the CIP process about protecting and providing better access or making improvements to your open space network? But also, how do you also think about the role that land that will be developed plays over time, and are there regulatory changes that can happen so that as a piece of land is developed, you're still connecting you're creating some connection between parcels, even if it's not through conserving lands. And I'll show a couple of examples of that. And then, what kind of a pretty document can you put it in that the average person might read? And so that's an important part too. All right. Portsmouth. So that's initially where we talked about open space planning before you came to the Town of Stratham. So I wanted to start with Portsmouth because it's one of the communities in the region that hasn't just done a natural resource inventory to inform the open space planning, but it's actually specifically did an open space plan, which it sounds like you may. And so what's interesting about Portsmouth, also a coastal community, is they had done some extensive inventory. So they had a lot of information about what parcels had what levels of protection, who was primarily the owner or responsible for those parcels, and then what access existed. Like, were there bootleg mountain bike trails? Were there formal trails maintained by city staff? Were they popular places in the neighborhood, but there was no parking and no signage, and you had to kind of be in the know to find it? Like, they had, some of this had been really well documented, so we were able to start with some of that. And then with a committee of folks that were city staff, nonprofit representatives, residents, we started to talk about, well, how do we engage people both in person and online to provide some direction, some feedback, similar to what you started doing here today. And their master plan had identified a few things that were important to think about how they framed protecting open space in the city. And one was, where do people live? And even more specifically, where do people who may be at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum and may have fewer transportation choices and more demands on their lives, where do they live? And how well can they access open space on foot from their homes? And so this map, this GIS map we created showed density of people, and then we were able to look at who's living there. Are they homeowners? Are they renters? Are they primarily people that are earning less than the median income in the community? Are there other challenges? And we were able to identify, wow, this is a tremendous amount of conserved land in the southern part of the city where a lot of those folks don't live. And there were fewer opportunities to the north, but there were still opportunities that existed. There were still things that could be done in the future, from the pocket park scale out to larger conserved lands, or working with those landowners to provide better access and provide better opportunities for people. Go to the next slide. And so the plan ended up looking at not only where the future opportunities are in the community, how the community connects to the open space network around it. And we looked at these green spaces, and then we looked at the value of even some of the smallest spaces on water. That gave you a sense of open space, that although it may be a very small investment or a very small resource, you were in an expansive location. That was really helpful. Provided some mental health therapeutic benefits, some community building benefit in the neighborhood, other things. And the reason we had done this sketch, this idea of a transect with Portsmouth, because at the end of the day, we know that this is a really dense urban location with fewer opportunities to create open space. There's well-defined parks and parklets. But there are big opportunities through the redevelopment to green the streets, green building, rooftops, walls, other spaces. And so this is where the regulatory piece came in. And then how do you use the roadway network, schools and school gardens, multi-use paths, and all of that to make these kind of green connections out to the larger blocks of land that are protected, that do have potential for access and for wildlife. So that's just a little bit of an overview. And we can come back to this. I can rack my brain and try to answer other questions about Portsmouth. But it's just one example nearby. It's probably worth looking at. And it's in a similar kind of budgetary area that you guys are so far. So that may help too. All right, what do we have next? So this is a different plan. We just finished working with Burlington at the end of 2021. The City of Burlington has an open space plan that they've been using for a while to identify land to protect and also amenities to create. What they realized was as part of their master planning and their climate planning, they really hadn't communicated to the public or asked the public for feedback on what value the tree canopy and the green spaces within the city provided from a climate perspective. So we did have what's referred to as a nature-based climate solution open space plan. And so we had to think about, okay, what do you have? You have forest lands, you have grasslands that are owned by the city, owned by schools, you have people's front yards, you have wetlands and riparian corridors, forested corridors along streams and rivers. And then you have urban spaces that have some landscaping, some green element. So it ended up that they identified 6 types of landscapes that crossed protected land, so privately or publicly held conserved land, that crossed private land, my front yard, a business, whatever, city-owned land, other things like that, and created a network in the city. And so then we started to talk to people about, well, what value do you get, and what would additional trees do for the city? How would that help reduce energy loads and CO2 emissions and meet some of their goals? How comfortable are people accessing some of these spaces? Do they feel safe? Do they have the amenities they need to get there? Are they served by public transit? Do they have parking? Things like that. And the city was very focused on engaging populations, student populations, and then also new American populations in the city. And what we heard through a lot of those conversations at the neighborhood scale is there was a fear of kind of gentrification. And so street trees, they got really upset when we started talking about street trees, but they had other ideas for food production and the greening of the neighborhood that actually more closely met their desires for being residents of the city. So we actually worked with a local artist for this one because getting people engaged in a larger community is hard. And so providing both online and in-person opportunities in Burlington. We'll go to the next slide. And framing it around these 5 different water, wetlands, green infrastructure in the built environment, agriculture and community gardens, lawns, fields, and small open spaces, and urban forests and tree canopy. All thinking about equity, inclusion, and relationships between people and between people and the places that they love, the open spaces that they love. All right, next one. Okay, coming back to New Hampshire, this is an example of a regional effort. Moose Mountains Regional Greenways stretches from Rochester, the city of Rochester, north to New Durham, close to Alton. So it's a fairly large conservation area. And rather than do individual open space plans for towns that are even smaller than Stratham, go to the next slide. We actually went and met with each of the towns and took a regional perspective. Every town had a master plan, had some thoughts about what the vision was for their future, how they wanted to guide development and land conservation, and they were different. They were different across the communities. So we tried to tease out what some of the themes were that were similar, and they were access for a variety of recreation types. That was one of the big priorities. Connectivity between large protected open spaces, and then some areas that were clearly identified as potential for future development that were considered really important to the select boards and the planning boards that we met with. What I think is really interesting about this as a takeaway for a town is when we called people together like you have today, we had people from all walks of life who all had different views of what land, and open land, and conservation land were. We had really strong collaboration between people who looked at that land for hunting and fishing and snowmobiling and ATV riding, with people that looked at it for bird watching, nature, just for its own value, hiking, mountain biking, cross-country skiing, things like that. And they came together, and together they had a really good understanding of the landscape and places that probably should be left alone, and places where there was an opportunity for a connection, and places where they saw conflict between the user groups. And so we actually had really good discussions where everybody was kind of around the table to say, well, this is what would be really good for us. This would be a helpful connection for us. Or we could move our snowmobile corridor to this location and get away from some of the places people were skiing. So that kind of dialogue happened at the regional scale, but a lot of it happened, like you saw on the previous slide, like around tables like this with maps, and letting people draw maps and say, well, this is what we know. This has been identified. The master plan is a need. What if we tried to protect this area over here and make some connection? Yes. Who's the client for this project? Moose Mountains Regional Greenways is a nonprofit. Right? So they were the client. They got the funding, and then they had us work directly with the towns as well. Yeah. And then I just had two examples from these conservation landscapes. They're huge. So that part doesn't translate. But what does translate is there's two different approaches here. In the Susquehanna Riverlands conservation landscape, during 2020 and 2021, we assisted them. And they have a tremendous amount of land conservation that's already happened. This is Lancaster and York County, Pennsylvania. They have priorities clearly identified for what else they'd like to conserve, and they have a range of partners. The challenge they have is that they have public land managers, utility land managers, municipalities, resource providers, and then user groups all kind of working in this landscape and not communicating. And so we had examples where there were, as one of their agencies, the game lands folks, they have land, and for generations they've had people who just pull up, get out of a pickup truck, and go hunt. They don't need a trail, they don't need a porta potty, they don't need any of the amenities. And then sometimes next to the game lands there would be a small piece of conservation land that the Lancaster Conservancy or some other group had. And those folks would have access to parking and kiosks, things like that, but no trail access or anything into the game lands. And when COVID happened, all of a sudden everybody is looking for open space and green space, right? And so now there were complaints from the municipalities about roads with cars everywhere, people cutting trails and connecting to places. So the focus of this was on integrated land management. And it was a lot about just getting these groups together to talk to say, okay, we're the Park and Rec Department, we have funding to do these types of things, but we need volunteers. And another group came, and the hiking group came, and they said, we have tons of volunteers, and we have tools, but we need permission to come in and do stuff on your land. And so partnerships started to be formed. There were state agencies that said we can provide training, and we can provide liability release to do stuff, but we need permission from these different organizations. So a lot of it was how do we coordinate, how do we communicate regularly, and how can we collaborate on a smaller scale across properties, start to have some shared signage, some shared understanding of maintenance and management and communication. Seeing this, we're doing a master plan for the town of Williamstown, Massachusetts. And before we ever got there, they had done some of this. They have nonprofit entities, they have Williams College, they have the town of Williamstown, and a lot of their conserved open space land that's popular for recreation abuts. And they've worked out similar signage, they've had a similar wayfinding system. And so it doesn't matter to me if I'm at the Clark Museum or on the Williams College piece of land, I want to go for a hike or I want to go for a bike ride. And prior to that, people would get to the edge of a property, and they would continue on the trail, and then the signage would just stop, and they were getting lost. And so they just figured out a way to work together towards a shared vision, even if they're each taking care of their own property. All right, and then one more example. So this is a project we have underway right now. This is the Kittatinny Ridge Conservation Landscape. It stretches from Maryland to New Jersey. And what's interesting here is that there's an ecologically important ridgetop. So it's important for migratory birds, it's important for hikers and bikers, it supports the Appalachian Trail, quite a bit of it. And what has never been the focus is the supporting landscape. So kind of back to Mark's map of the Wildlife Action Plan, and we talk about the really important lands and then these supporting landscapes. The supporting landscapes weren't looked at as much, and the supporting landscapes go into different municipalities and go into people's neighborhoods and go into disadvantaged neighborhoods. And they weren't thinking about kind of connections back to the kind of the gems of the region, and they are now. And I think that can be an opportunity too. It's even thinking about how are those bicycle and pedestrian improvements that Mark mentioned, how are those potentially maybe a little bit greener or thought about so they provide the connection to your open space? Like how do the pieces fit together? All right, next slide. That's it. So I just wanted to kind of throw a bunch of different things. Hopefully some of it stuck and some of it was of use. But I'm just happy to answer questions and be part of a dialogue.
Not a management plan in the sense of like a forestry plan.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking from the municipality's perspective, you know, we have a role in, along with the Conservation Commission, of, you know, overseeing, managing properties that we either own outright or we're an easement holder for, or we have some sort of other interest.
Yep.
But while we have acquired these lands, it's my observation that the management hasn't kept up with as we've added to the fold. And that means, you know, the monitoring is done. There's not necessarily a system for following up.
Sure.
So there's an operations issue. And then in terms of following up on what the rights are of the town to utilize the property, that there seems to be a gap there. So there might be potential to exercise rights, but there's no plan in place to prioritize which rights and which amenities to add and in which location. So can you talk about how your experience or what those are components of plans as well?
Yeah, I think my outline was oversimplified to not tell you there was one way to do it, but to kind of focus on the core elements. Within those 5 points, you could address the management plan piece. I think what you have as a benefit here in New Hampshire is we don't have a process you have to follow. The state's not paying for your open space plan, so you can do an open space plan that's going to be the best tool for you. And so if it has to have a management component that's as important as a strategic conservation component, you can do that. And it can address all the issues you just identified and bring in on some of those partners. And some of those partners might be homeowners associations and some of these places that showed up as that kind of red-orange color that we don't know, long-term what will happen to them. But to address what's been challenging from a staff perspective or a committee perspective, where are residents seeing limitations? They just don't understand why you don't have parking or trails there, and you can explain, these are some of the challenges here, it's how it's different. But then how are you going to do it over time? How does it get monitored? How does it get tracked? How do people provide feedback on it? It's working. So I think you could do that with this plan.
And so does that sort of fall into action planning? Like your action planning is looking forward, here are some strategic areas you would like to conserve or ways for connecting, but then also how you utilize the open space that you have.
It very well can, yeah.
And are there other pieces of action planning that I'm not thinking about for your?
No, those are primarily them. They're, what kind of investments you're going to make, what internal communication changes. So everything that is identified as a priority or an opportunity during the inventory and analysis should then somehow be addressed later on. It continues to be a priority through some kind of actions. And some of the actions will be things that you have to do as a municipality and bring to town meeting, things that you have to do maybe through regulatory means or as future land is protected, to know that there are some uses you want to have in place in those agreements.
Yeah.
So it's kind of being kind of vague because it's pretty wide,
yeah.
and it comes back to your priorities. What do you want? What do you think is most important for future generations of residents?
I also would be interested in your perspective, like from the Conservation Commission perspective, we've seen a movement toward people, 10 years ago people were like, oh, you can conserve land and if deer can just live on it and that's nice. And
Yes.
now they're like, we want trail system, we want access, we want all these uses. I mean, do you see that as well, like just as a general trend?
Yeah, in my own town. So in my own town, I own land, I own a tree farm that we put trails on that connect to other trails.
Yeah.
And the Conservation Commission, over generations, the responsibility has fallen on the Conservation Commission to maintain a growing number of trails.
Yeah.
Our rec department doesn't have the staff or the funding to do it, and our Conservation Commission is aging.
Yeah.
And a lot of those folks bring a tremendous commitment to the town and a history of how all this came together, but they have either don't have the ability or the desire to go out and cut a tree, fallen tree.
Yeah.
So we created a trails subcommittee that's under the Conservation Commission that now works with landowners, does landowner agreements for trails, can be called to go and do maintenance. We've attracted a ton of volunteers that don't want to go to meetings, but that would love to go out with a chainsaw or a rake. And so it's a different group of folks.
Yeah.
But we come back to the Conservation Commission for any new projects.
Yeah.
And
That's
so
interesting.
it's that lens.
Yeah.
And I think there are lots of different ways you can do that.
Yeah.
But I can understand what you're saying. People want trails.
Yeah. And our Conservation Commission does not do groundwork.
Right.
So.
Then don't start.
No, I mean, so. Yeah, so I'd be interesting to think about models of how that work gets done. I mean, it's really falls into the recreation department to manage it, but there are two people, and right, so.
Yeah, it's challenging. Sure.
What you discussion you opened up, Allison, and makes Stratham somewhat, not necessarily unique, but it's characteristic of us is a lot of our open space is agricultural land, and some of it's still under production or with a lot of potential for production. And speaking from the Heritage Commission perspective, we feel that is something very important to protect. I think it benefits the town, but it also speaks to the evolution of our town and what makes Stratham Stratham. And many of you may not know that Stratham has some of the best agricultural land in the state. Not only that, we have other natural resources, gravel, sand, on and on, that used to be, there was some mining going on here of gravel and sand and so forth. You probably
I did it,
yeah. Not that we, these are all things to take into consideration because they are resources. And I've also, in my work with the Heritage Commission, become aware that this, the kind of tension that you mentioned between interests, because certainly it's to our benefit to preserve agricultural land, but public access to agricultural land that's being actively used can be problematic. So, I mean, I know in England this is some, pathways and it's quite common and there's tension there, but they have resolved it in many cases, although sometimes you need to be careful about what kind of animals are in the field. Anyway, so these are all things that need to be taken into consideration.
I think that's one of the historic and cultural resources piece is one of the ways that you may differentiate also through your open space plan what some of your priorities are. We're finishing a master plan with the town of Amherst, New Hampshire, and they have the same. They haven't really had conversations between kind of the land conservation and trails folks and the historic and cultural resources folks until the master planning process. And they've identified that there are a lot of places where the historic and cultural resources folks know that there are important locations and stories that they don't have access to that are further out in rural parts of the community. And there's some partnership there that have some trail connections and some wayfinding and storytelling about those places. And then there are places that they really don't want to see, lots of human traffic. And so those conversations are great. And together they shape what drew people to that community, and what they love about it. Some of the barns and fields that they drive by, they have the scenic vista that maybe don't provide hiking and walking opportunities. tapestry of the town. And so figuring out what those priorities are here and where those special places are and to what degree you can stitch them together ecologically, even if you can't stitch everything together with human access, could be part of how you start to prioritize.
Another resource we have is the former ad hoc land conservation bond committee, because that ended when they ran out of money, but my guess is that they left behind some priorities and other properties they were interested in looking at, and it would really be worthwhile to go back and look at their minutes, their reports, the veterans of that process. I think it's too bad there aren't some of those people here today, but I know that there were some, targets that they were not able to reach before the money ran out.
I think Dan is the only person still on the commission now, but it was Dan and Pat.
Well, Nate Merrill, who's our chair.
I mean, like on the conservation commission, but yeah, and Roger and.
Having a conversation with them would be good.
Yeah.
Really thinking about what's left that they're aware
One of the things that I took away from the discussions and the report and the Trail Management Advisory Committee is this and it's partly informed by paying close attention to Stratham Hill Park, but also informed by the experience of the pandemic, is that lots of user group conflicts in a very popular Stratham Hill Park, which is the core cultural and recreational resource for the town. It's where our town forest is, and many other related, contiguous, conserved lands that are privately held. One of the things that I think this open space plan can help us respond to is the popularity of that place needs to be managed, and the Stratham Hill Park Master Plan and the Trail Management Advisory Committee and their recommendations that they're moving forward are a start on that. The open space plan is to broaden and hopefully put the resource of the park in the perspective of the broader assets that we have, and help us articulate the role that the park is going to play and what other assets we can be brought to bear to perhaps lessen the user conflicts and expand the opportunities. And when you start having that conversation about potential other areas to play those roles is the marketing associated with their use. And immediately the reaction is, well, we needn't create a destination place here. Have you seen communities actively think through the extent to which they make accessible, sign, market areas that are kind of ancillary or off the beaten track?
Yeah, there are a spectrum of ways that's been done. A lot of times it comes down to people don't know where to go, so they go to the popular spot that they're comfortable with. And so in sharing with them as residents, and that's sort of the question is, to what level are you publicizing these places and creating a draw to Stratham for people from outside? I can go on my phone and use Trailforks and any number of apps and find where everyone's going on trails and where they're spending time, and I can go seek those places out kind of as an outsider already. Like the information's out there. But we've found in communities often if there's not a kiosk, there's not a place to park, there's not a bathroom for their child to use maybe, they're going to go to the Stratham Hill Parks, they're going to go to the bigger places. But when shared that there are other opportunities, and that there are other opportunities that maybe are more specialized for certain user groups too, I think that can help. And there are communities that are further ahead that would be good as case studies to kind of look at what did they do and to what degree did that help.
Yeah, so it's really that tension of there are properties that have a conservation easement on them where the owners are like, it's okay if some people walk here. They wouldn't want like a parking lot or a sign or advertised. And so when we think about like taking pressure off of Stratham Hill Park, I can only think of two places that the town town like outright owns, where we could have people go, and one of them doesn't really have much parking, and one of them has abutters that hate anybody coming near the property that they don't, that's next to them. So, it's just that like we can't, I don't think we can easily say, hey, everybody go over to, the Zarnowski property and go there instead. It's going to create a huge disaster. So that piece, I think, is sort of what you were asking about, and how do you like enhance your conservation areas without creating real conflicts or real overuse?
Yeah, I know. I hear what you're saying. Are there other lands that could still be protected that could earn that opportunity? That maybe are in a better location from an access perspective, and maybe would be a fresh start to say, like, okay, we're going to do access here, and only a small percentage of people are going to make it onto that conservation easement that's already protected.
Yeah.
But we're going to try to do some things here to both serve people in the neighborhood so they're within a short walk or drive, or kids have access to open space beyond their yard, but maybe also to address the fact that people are going to be sensitive to the marketing of a brand new parking lot and a bunch of folks from away pulling in, to do stuff.
I've been here long enough to hear rumors.
Sure.
And the potential of that type of development and access to and all of that. So I'd be excited to engage in an open space plan to see where if those opportunities actually exist, and what that would look like for the community. I represent Stratham Hill Park and it's the recreation department. I run the programs, the space. So it would be nice too to have other assets within the community, town owned, that we could utilize in that capacity, kind of spreading it out a little bit more. But for me, ideally, it would be great to identify, even if they were just pocket places for neighborhoods to be able to access right from their back door, close enough that you could access, by a bicycle, as opposed to having to hop into a car. So I'd be excited to explore those. I've spent a lot of hours looking at maps and deeds and easements and all that through the years to kind of piece together at a professional level. I would really appreciate that because, like I said, there's a lot of things that I've heard, and it'd be exciting for me to be able to actually make it all come together and have community.
Well, I think hearing that presents an opportunity. Like however you decide to do an open space plan, and whoever you work with. Because I'm just here because I like talking about this stuff. There's no guarantee it would be us or anybody else. So depending on how you proceed, that local knowledge that you bring and that the board and committee members bring to it, to say, okay, this neighborhood is not the right place for us to do this, but are there other ways we can access these properties? And they lead you to identify other municipal properties where parking could be appropriate, other partners, churches, business owners that would dedicate a space that had a kiosk and had access. So it can get very creative once you identify what kind of barriers you're up against and start engaging people in the conversation. And have them feel like they're part of this team. They're not just reacting and criticizing what's going on. Like they're asked to come in and help you figure out how can we do it in a way that will work for a variety of people here in Stratham. At what scale makes sense.
Have you seen any successful partnerships with the utility corridors? We have a tremendous amount of space, frankly, linking our community. And, I have not personally taken a deep dive about what the permissions that are currently in place are. What are the limitations? What have you seen there?
I can't cite any great examples, like off the top of my head, but I think it's worth pursuing. And I think identifying, is it natural gas and electric, like overhead lines? So having those conversations with representatives of the groups to understand what they're up against would be great, and understand what they would entertain and what would be a non-starter for them, and to see how that could help. That's a great identification of a possibility. And I think we could also, in doing that, we could also look in New Hampshire for similar communities that have some of the same utilities as case studies. And it could be great PR for those utility companies. But I wish I could tell you that there's like a gem that I know of. It's not. You might have to be that, Jim.
Well, you had it listed for maybe Pennsylvania. You had it as one of the management groups.
Yeah, in there it's more like the dams, like so all the hydro dams are these huge areas of land as part of their mitigation. They have to provide this land, and some of the dams as they phase out over time, they don't really care about amenities, but they have to provide the land. So there are nearby groups who would provide amenities and access and take over the land.
Okay.
So those utilities were a little different.
Gotcha. Okay.
I don't think we were dealing with kind of the right-of-way utilities.
Okay. That's okay.
Yeah.
One of the, we have let's see, there's an acquisition that is being considered right now that abuts a very large conservation piece that is owned by a conservation organization, and it's in an area where we currently don't have vehicular access. And part of the examples of how a plan like this could be useful would be to articulate those needs for when new opportunities come up. You can articulate a need for things to be looking for. And one of the observations I would make coming in trying to learn about Stratham's network of open spaces is that they're conserved, but the access isn't broad. So we may need to prioritize emphasizing access as part of future acquisitions.
Right.
Well, that was the point. Sorry.
Yes. So that's good.
Oh, okay.
If I provoked a response, then I'm done.
You always provoke a response. That was the point I was making earlier, like where we used to just conserve land and it was like for wildlife corridors and habitat, and now everyone's like they want a parking lot. So that, and so maybe you just accept that going forward. When you start to look at where you're prioritizing it. I don't always love it as the Conservation Commission, but I recognize that it's a shifting mentality that people believe they deserve access to properties.
I think thinking about that infrastructure, and then how you're going to move people across the landscape and where it's appropriate, and how you're going to maintain it long term. Like all those pieces are important, and it might mean you're buying some small parcels that don't have any conservation value to provide access in a place that everyone can agree is okay.
The other thing I want to put out for you is that when we interviewed our DPW director, he mentioned that he'd done a lot of work with pocket parks and was sort of interested in that piece. So when we think about this, I feel like he should be a part of that conversation because it seemed like something he was interested in. So. And I like the way, I like the idea of thinking about open space, not just like what do we want to conserve, but how do we just have a greener town. So I think I like that approach.
The more it's integrated, the more everyone can kind of feel like they're benefiting from it.
Yeah.
We're seeing the evolution of it.
Yeah.
It's interesting because when I was part of the ill-fated gateway planning thing, and one of the elements that we considered it being positive about it was that, especially on this east side of Portsmouth Avenue, there was a lot of connectivity to conserved lands that currently weren't accessible. And we saw that as an opportunity to make that connection between, and especially making that back part small residences, residential uses that would be abutting that way. And maybe there still are opportunities for that concept in that area.
Running with that, one of the pieces that you spoke about, that you were particularly interested in the education piece.
Yep.
I think the maintenance and the management of everything and the inventory. Like I see a need for the inventory and the maintenance and the management, but the education piece seems to be a really big part. Communicating to the town, the people of our town, like why these things are still important, and communicating to them the different definitions of open space, that it can be agriculture where you don't need to go walking there, or it can be a walking place. And kind of coming up with a concise education plan that is able to overcome the rumor mill of Stratham talks and all that, being able to actually come up with a really powerful package that people can hear over over all the chatter. That's something you said that you bring to your firm. What ways have you seen the education piece really help move open space open space plans into like a real and feasible thing?
I think using that as you develop your RFP or kind of scope of work, however you're going to structure your project, if you can use the open space planning process, the year plus maybe that you'll spend on open space planning, to engage people and educate them on some of the things you talked about, like different types of land, what the value is, why some have access to the public and some don't. But for that education to be both ways. I mean, I always am a fan of the education piece because I need to be educated if I'm coming into a community because I don't have the background that you have. I don't understand where the landmines are in conversations. I don't understand some places that are non-starters for thinking about access, some neighborhoods that would just end the project. And so having a conversation, inviting everyone in to be part of the team at whatever level they want to participate, and providing constant connections back to them, like, well, this is what we found out. And, oh, look, Mark found this great resource, and we want to tell you about it. And, we have this landowner that stepped up and said that they'd never considered trails before, but they're hearing the dialogue, and like to share some of these stories and some of the challenges. Utility corridors, they said no, they won't talk to us. So that I think that they can provide feedback, provide direction and ideas, but feel invested in the open space plan, because doing the plan is just like act one. And then you have all that work that all of your boards and staff are trying to do over the next decade plus. You don't want to be fighting everybody every step of the way with every regulatory change or every infrastructure improvement or every land purchase. So I think being very intentional on how you design your outreach and engagement so that it is educational for all of you and for the public. And often that means not using things like I did of green infrastructure and using more art and telling more stories and asking people for feedback. Making it more digestible so that in the 30 seconds you can catch them on Facebook, in the newspaper, at a store, in their busy day, that you might engage them enough that they might circle back to you.
So we asked people that couldn't be here just some basic questions. What are we doing well in terms of open space planning in Stratham? I'll just share with you some of the responses and we can continue the discussion. But people felt like we had a pretty good inventory of different open space properties. Someone complimented us for focusing on the park recently and the management of the park. Someone said the town has prioritized land conservation. And said we did a really good job 20 years ago. And someone just kind of a similar comment that we've done a good job in preserving and developed parcels. One other one that wasn't mentioned, but I think the town's done a pretty good job of protecting agricultural land compared to other towns. Any other thoughts on areas we're doing well? Go to the next one, which is challenges. I think there's a lot of agreement that communication, sharing, and an inventory of what we have and what's allowed in different properties, that's kind of the big one that came out of this. People don't know what land they can access and what land they can't. Someone said there's a lack of a big push by the town and the Conservation Commission to get another big bond for conservation land funding. There's a lack of communication with property owners. And someone else said that there's been kind of a paradigm shift where landowners see this more towards the eye of profitability when they work with the town instead of trying to do a good deed by preserving land.
That's very true.
Other challenges
I don't really understand the last point. Could you maybe flesh that out a little bit?
I think historically people wanted to see their land protected, and now it feels like when we have conversations with people, they want to make money, and that's why they're doing it. That's why they want to put their land in conservation. And I think it probably has to do with how expensive land is right now, but So it's, the conversations are harder because they're really looking to make money off of the conservation easement. And they're getting offers from developers that are outrageous. So.
Maybe a lack of understanding of like what your commitment is to then also monitor the land and take care of that land.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think conservation easements are going to be harder because of that.
So just the cost of it is going up.
Cost of it is going up, yeah. It feels like, I mean, Bob could probably, or Brad could speak to this, like, maybe it was more altruistic at one point that they wanted to see their land conserved, and now they're like, there's a lot of money in land, how can I get some of this money? Without having to actually sell my land to a developer.
Well, initially, 20 years ago, we were trying to preserve the agricultural element in town. And at that point, farmers wanted to keep their farms, so it was easy, and there was funds that we probably, that $5 million, I think we initially added another another $250,000 just in matching grants. So
I mean, more than that.
Probably more than that numbers. But we made out very well. And now the farmers aren't here. And the farmers that are here are probably struggling to some extent. But at that point, it was easy. It was a win-win for the Conservation Commission, it was a win for the town and for the landowner. And that's what 20 years does.
That's a significant change in 20 years.
The people here 20 years ago didn't want to see the houses that would have been out there where the cows are, essentially. But we've had a lot more people moving into town that don't seem to mind houses. I prefer the cows itself.
This is a question I asked us as I'm the town planner, so I have an interest in this, but I don't know if it's super relevant to the open space. But, the question was, how do we do a good job of balancing land conservation and stewardship with our other goals, housing, economic development, those kind of needs. So someone said we should take another look at the 2-acre minimum lot size, which is most of the town. That's a requirement for residential. Someone else said we should have additional source water protection regulations. Someone else, and this is a good point, we have pretty good zoning for the gateway corridor. It's just unfortunately it's not going to really develop that way unless we have public water and sewer access, which we don't have. And someone else just made a comment that they felt the balance could be improved. And this is kind of the most important question probably is, what do you want the plan to focus on most? Someone said really focus on agricultural land that's not protected. Someone else said similar thing, focus on environmental and farmland protection. Someone else said a management plan that clarifies the town's responsibilities and different roles for the Conservation Commission and town staff. And I'm not quite sure what I was going on. I think it was probably advertising just where the public can access different lands and where they
Just
can.
call up the Boston Globe, don't they?
And I think even just in the little bit of time you've had together today, you've identified other things, historic and cultural resources, like you've started to broaden out maybe what the focus would be. And in some cases, how can a property meet multiple objectives for different groups, provide connectivity, provide an understanding of the history and the culture of the community, provide ecological value, continue to kind of serve the community aesthetically in other ways.
So, given that this is the most important question, as we close, is there anything we missed in terms of just things we should really focus on when we do the RFP for this and bring on a consultant?
Build on the focus on agricultural lands currently not protected, and add to that to focus on the agricultural lands that currently are protected. I know I know of at least one farmer in town who's looking to get out of the business. And that land, while it might remain protected, will not likely be farmed. There's a farm on my street that is infrequently farmed. Our farm, when we took it over, had been growing for years, but before that hadn't been growing for many years. And there's many days where I'm like, what am I doing with my life? I could totally just mow this every day instead. And I think this town did at one point put a lot of value in agricultural production, having local food, and there's a lot of lip service given to that, but having in the open space plan an education piece and a management piece that actually puts priority on keeping those farms in business, keeping those farms profitable and functional would be pretty awesome.
But also even making unused agricultural lands available to farmers who might be able to rent it or just starting out, that kind of thing.
I'm the vice chair of the regional National Young Farmers Coalition. That's a conversation we have all the time is how do we get young farmers to actually start farming in this area? And land access is always the case.
It really upset me when I live at 200 Portsmouth Avenue. There's a parking lot and access to trails there, and there are 2 farm fields behind it. And it really upset me when the developer demolished the small house that was on the roadside, and then the land was just growing up into shrubbery. And that house could have been rented to a young farmer, and there's several acres behind that could have been farmed. So it's a kind of a lost opportunity there, and there may be similar sort of things.
The last thing I think to mention is, since I've come here, I've been daunted by the idea that some have wanted to really invest in bike and pedestrian planning in our town, and I think they've been frustrated at the lack of traction we've had on adding amenities and making it feel safer. And I just feel the narrow rights of way along the state corridors, which we do not control, to be just a daunting obstacle in making families feel comfortable that they can move about this town on the roadways. And I think one of the most interesting deep dives that the open space plan could do is to, let's abandon the streets for moving about this town, and how can we, what are the linkages that are needed with our open space assets in those places we don't yet control or have eased in our favor? How can we alleviate the fear around relying on those state roadways and make that the network for bikes and peds?
And seeing it as an opportunity for some off-corridor connections and creating a network.
Right.
Yeah. And the Pedestrian Cycling Advocacy Committee put a lot of work into trying to do that and knocked on people's doors and things, and it was hard. They had a few successes, and they had some. So any sort of advice, support toward doing that, because I always thought oh my god, how cool would it be to live in a town where you could just take trails all over town? But it was a tough road for them. So just thinking about how, if there are towns that have been really successful in it, and what other ways can we think about getting homeowners to support it? Or, if the utility companies supported it, it would be amazing, because that's a great way to get around.
I think what was missing in those previous well-intentioned efforts that were, kind of exciting concepts is the stamina and the backing of a plan that gave the governance the strength and ability to say, well, we can advocate for this because this connection is prioritized. And by the way, our plan said it's okay to use conservation monies or other available funds to play ball with a property owner who needs to be played ball with. Right. And to me, that would be the maturation of the effort. It takes all those efforts to the next level when you say, it's okay to put money into this.
Yeah.
And here, by the way, here's a process for bringing the parties together period. So I think that's something that could be extraordinarily exciting for this plan.
Having lived through most of that, I agree with what you said. With what we were trying to do with the cyclists and pedestrians in town. So I think you're right on with that.
And there may be a really interactive piece that could happen both in person and online, where people could collaborate on, by looking at maps, and even go out into the town and look at sections where you're saying, like, could there be a connection here? If easements were secured, could we put a trail connection off corridor into this area? And what would the considerations be? And what would the concerns be from area neighbors? And then show them some case studies of where it's worked really well. Because that would be a nice complement to the open space plan, and it also differentiates, once again, how your open space plan might be different than others.
We don't have it marked specifically on the map, but just to Dave's point about the power line, you think there's a huge one. You see it kind of cuts right through this.
Oh, wow, yeah. Zigzags right through.
And there's others as well.
Do things like sidewalks and so forth get considered in this? Because I think that there are neighborhoods where you couldn't necessarily connect in the back, but having a sidewalk would help considerably.
I think they can, especially if you have this kind of bicycle pedestrian component to your city plan, it would make sense. In the Portsmouth example, where there's so much development, looking at if road improvements were made along some of those main corridors, how could you add greenery and bicycle and pedestrian, so it's aligned with the bicycle pedestrian plan in the city of that. But how could you do it so that it's also kind of a logical connection while also providing comfort to the people that are walking, biking, waiting for transit. So I think if you're really clear about what your intentions are, then what are these spur connections, and is there an opportunity to green those as well over time? Yeah, and in some cases also just incentivizing or encouraging landowners to plant trees, in certain types of trees, native trees, in a certain distance from the sidewalk, if the right-of-way doesn't.
Well, this has been, I think, a great initial conversation. Thank you, Stephen, very much. Thank you, Mark, for putting this together. And thank you for coming. And so, what's going to happen next? Digesting this conversation, the Select Board has identified advancing the open space plan this year as a priority. So, Mark and I will advance this discussion probably to refining a scope for what we want. I imagine circulating that amongst the boards and commissions that are engaged here, but probably not picking up on contract and process until after the summer. But that's kind of what we see right now. And if you have any questions, suggestions, cautions, doubts, share them with us anytime so we can be aware and incorporate them. All right, thank you.
Thanks for doing this.